My name's Oisín Callery. I'm like a bad superhero. I'm a lecturer by day, researcher by night. Not as exciting as Batman or anything. I don't fight crime. But I was invited here because I'm participating in the BioProtect project, which is a sister project to Pharos. So it's a 4-year project, started in May 2 years ago. So it's hard to believe we're already 2 years into it. It's also part of the mission restore our oceans and waters by 2030. So I suppose, unlike some horizon funding or research funding, this is very much intended, like Pharos, to have those sort of live implemented solutions to quite urgent problems as opposed to just research output. So it's very exciting for us to get to work with stakeholders, to work with NGOs, to work with policy makers, etc. And that's very much what BioProtect is aiming to do. So we have 18 partners, universities, research institutes spread across 8 different countries. And it's also in the Arctic Atlantic Lighthouse, which in Mission Ocean speak means it's a region where we can test and develop these solutions to the problems that we face. So in the case of BioProtect, the solutions we're aiming to develop as an area-based management decision support framework to identify priority areas for conservation. Basically a toolkit to help people identify those areas that we should prioritize for conservation and restoration in order to reach these targets that Tim actually introduced earlier for 2030. There's a lot happening within the BioProtect project. For example, mapping of pressures and activities, looking at socioeconomic impacts of implementing these conservation measures. But very selfishly, I'm going to talk to you about my work within the project because, well, I'm stealing the opportunity. Why not? And what I'm looking at is the development of tools that will allow stakeholders to be involved in these processes and co-design processes that instead of just having the government come in and say, right, this area is for conservation and like it or lump it, that's what's happening. The idea is that to bring those stakeholders in at the earliest possible opportunity and to co-develop solutions that work for everyone and help to achieve everyone's aims together. As part of that, we're developing a workflow which we're calling multi-scale systematic conservation planning. I'll get back to that later, but that is quite core to the entire BioProtect project. So as Tim has already gone through this, and I suspected he would, I won't linger too much on this 30 by 30 initiative, which I guess most people in the room are probably familiar with. Obviously, conserving and effectively managing 30% of land and water by 2030 and ensuring that where areas are used for non-purely conservation goals and objectives, that they are managed in such a way as it's conducive to co-use. So for example, you could have co-location of marine protected areas and offshore renewable energy. Perhaps these are things that are not mutually exclusive, that they can actually work together, but that the areas still need to be managed with a conservation first sort of approach. But the reason I have this slide up at all is just to say that this target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, as Tim mentioned earlier, this is the kind of strategy that's leading the global push for 30 by 30. Stakeholder engagement is not something that would be nice or, it's aspirational. It's baked into the very language of it that we have to recognize and respect Indigenous rights, local communities, and traditional territories in this process. And again, this kind of key term, equitably governed, right? That the systems we develop have to be equitably governed. So what does that mean? Again, the language is not particularly ambiguous because in this global biodiversity framework, they define equitable governance by 3 different dimensions. So the first dimension is recognition, and that is to say that there are a huge diversity of stakeholders, the people that have an interest and their own values, their own hopes and aspirations and dependencies on the marine environment. And all of those have to be recognized and respected as equally valid. So that could be researchers like myself, it could be policymakers, it could be fishermen, it could be local coastal communities, but everyone has an opinion, has some skin in the game, so to speak, and that has to be recognized and respected, and those stakeholders have to be involved in the process of reaching this 30 by 30 goal, which brings me to the next dimension of equity. which is procedure. And this is where I suppose I spend a lot of my time, is how do you actually involve those stakeholders in the procedure? How do you facilitate the dialogue that needs to happen between stakeholders and policymakers? And how do you share the information that's required to make informed decisions and ultimately find, I jokingly say, the solution that makes everyone equally unhappy, but also the solution that makes everyone equally happy. And it brings me to the last point, the last dimension of equity, which I suppose is the most commonly understood dimension of equity, distribution. So that is equitable sharing of costs and benefits. So obviously different stakeholders will be affected in different ways by whatever measures are developed. And it shouldn't be that one stakeholder is completely excluded from the marine space to the advantage or to the benefit of another stakeholder. There needs to be a recognition that everyone is affected, may be affected differently, and may have different, I suppose, might to throw around. So it's not fair that an industry would come in and then just overpower local communities, for example. Do we have anyone from New Zealand in the audience by any chance? Okay, this is yes. Online, yes. Okay, apologies in advance for this. Okay, this is the Zealandia Te Mara Atane National Park in Wellington. Apologies, I'm sorry for the pronunciation. But this is an example, or one example I found, of what I would consider to be an effectively managed protected area, right? So they've built this incredible fence around, I think it's an area of about 220 hectares in Wellington in New Zealand. It's a pest-proof fence. So it demonstrates, I think, pretty much all of what would constitute effective management. So the first one is, it's not just on paper, it's not just a line drawn on paper, it's a clearly delineated and managed area. In this case, we have a pest-proof fence that stops rats, etc., getting in and killing flightless birds, the kiwi being probably the most iconic, eating their eggs, etc. As I said, yeah, the rules that are implemented within it have very clear reasons and are effectively enforced by the population there. Very clear evidence of ecological benefit in terms of, you can see thriving native fauna within the enclosure. And then the local communities are involved heavily in the management decisions that are made for this park, okay? But I would say that this terrestrial example is actually very simple compared to the case in the oceans, right? Because a 2D fence does not work in a 3D ocean, obviously enough. So MPA boundaries can't block, literally physically block fish, larvae, and also the pressures that would affect the ecosystem components within the MPA. So pollution, heat waves, all of this. Has anyone seen the Spillhouse ocean projection that there's only one ocean, it's all interconnected? But that's true, and it is a massive challenge that we face in MPAs. All of the marine systems are highly connected, and these boundaries mean absolutely nothing to the whales, the fish, the marine mammals, etc., that will pass through the boundaries. And it sort of falls to us to respect the phrase that springs to mind is the spirit of the law and not just the letter of the law. We need to have our stakeholders invested in the process. And if there was just one small phrase that would sum up this entire presentation for me, it would be that MPA effectiveness relies on cooperation, right? And that's true of all conservation efforts, yes, but I think more so of MPAs than anything else, because of the fact that you can't have a literal fence to keep things out. You can't have, as you would say in certain countries in Africa, if you're protecting rhinoceros, you would have literal armed guards, bodyguards. You can't implement that in the ocean. It's too vast. You can't have these physical barriers. We need buy-in from stakeholders. People need to see the legitimacy of what it is that they're doing, and they need to play ball. So in order to get that, you need to engage with stakeholders early and show them that this is legitimate, that there are benefits for them, and that they can see the sense in it. So what I'm describing, I guess, is the paradigm shift that's required from some of the more traditional forms of conservation, like I've shown in that New Zealand example. And I do think that the New Zealand example is still a very strong one, but it is an example of what would be called fortress conservation, where you're going to establish a fortress and keep the scary humans out, view humans as threats, and That's just not going to work in the MPA. Certainly not in Ireland, not in Europe, not anywhere globally. Humans have to be seen as managing partners, and again, effective stakeholder engagement and early in that process is critical to that. And also, I'm sure if I have a marine biologist come up to a fisherman down here in Tralee, I'm sure that marine biologist is going to know something that fisherman doesn't know, even if he spent 30, 40 years at sea every day. A marine biologist might have something that he doesn't know. And then vice versa, a fisherman is going to be able to tell a marine biologist so much that despite all of his training, all of his research, he had no idea about the realities on the ground. And by having that merger of scientific knowledge and local experience, that's where you really start to make effective decisions. So everything has to be co-designed, negotiated, and participatory rather than simply imposed by the state and the policymakers. Because if stakeholders don't see the MPAs as legitimate, they won't respect it. It won't be effective. It will become a paper park, right? We can pat ourselves on the back. We can give a big round of applause for ourselves and say, look, we've designated 30%, we did it. But if it's just lines on a map, it means nothing. And we need to avoid that. So as I suppose has become quite clear, there are multiple stakeholders and they come from incredibly diverse backgrounds and incredibly diverse perspectives, and they bring a lot of different knowledge and values to the table. I use this phrase of having too much data and not enough information, and I kind of take it from my own work because say in Europe, we spend 1.4 billion euros every year in ocean observations. So that's, if you think about research cruises, you can think about the Irish research vessels, but you think about that on the European scale, you bring in remote sensing, satellite observations, all of the modeling efforts. How many horizon projects have we talked about, and all of the cruises that they organize, etc. The amount of data that we have is incredible, but what the hell does it all mean together? How can you connect the dots between these huge data sets? It's challenging for scientists. I would say it's possibly impossible for scientists as well. But imagine then for stakeholders who don't have scientific training, who aren't able to use, for example, programming tools to access these data. They don't know where to find it. How do you bring that to the table? Obviously, extremely complex interactions. We still don't have the data. We talk about, Tim mentioned the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, good ecological status. What even is that? We don't know. We still don't know despite all the data that we've collected. And it leads to, I suppose, at times, a suboptimal science policy interaction. So this all leads me to a solution, not to worry. Systematic conservation planning, right? So what systematic conservation planning is a transparent and repeatable framework by which to identify priority areas for conservation, right? So that it can take all of these data that we're collecting through scientific and also through processes of like stakeholder engagement, collecting local knowledge, etc. It can take all those data and try to make sense of what it means together, right? At the very heart of systematic conservation planning is about trying to strike a balance between conservation and socioeconomic disruption. Obviously, if you close an area completely to human activity, that's going to have a real knock-on effect on people's lives, on people's livelihoods. So we need to find an optimal balance whereby we achieve our conservation objectives, but at an absolute minimal disruption to the livelihoods that depend on the ocean. What that looks like in practice is applying a grid over the area that's being managed. Literally a grid of squares or hexagons, whatever it is, looking within each grid cell and saying what habitats, species, activities, etc. are present, and then identifying those areas that will cause minimal disruption. So it's very easy if there's 7 cells. In 7 cells, you can see, okay, if we simply conserve cell C and E, we get all of the biodiversity that we want to protect, and it's a minimal disruption, it's a minimal area. When there's 70,000 or 7 million cells, it becomes more difficult. So really all that systematic conservation planning does is it solves this problem, but it solves it on a very vast scale that we just can't do as humans. But it is completely transparent. If you can understand this example, you understand systematic conservation planning. The computer just makes it possible to do it at a very large scale. So just to understand the language of systematic conservation planning, which is important to really get it. Conservation features, that is what we want to protect. So generally I'm saying habitat species, but it could be something else. It could be sites of like importance for heritage, for example. It doesn't have to just be one thing. Targets, how much do we need to preserve? Tim mentioned 30 by 30, that's commonly thrown around, but you know, do we want to only preserve 30% of the seagrass in Galway Bay? Maybe it's 100%. Maybe we want to set, like they did in New Zealand, 225 hectares of forest, right? So they are quantitative goals which allow us to establish if we've been successful or not, right? We need to be able to say, well, have we hit 30%? Yes or no? Will we hit 30% by 2030? I don't know. I'm hopeful, but we have a lot of work to do. Cost. As I said, there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to be done when we look at conservation and socioeconomic goals, but it doesn't have to just be a cost in terms of monetary cost, right? There's the opportunity, for example, perhaps I love going jet skiing, and if we close an area for the conservation of marine mammals, I'll be sad. It's a missed opportunity for me, but perhaps if I see it as a legitimate loss that I can't go tearing around on my jet ski for the conservation of marine mammals, I'll understand this. So it doesn't just have to be monetary. And then there are obvious constraints as well. So the constraints can be, for example, that there already exists a protected network that we have to tie into, or constraints could be just local saying, absolutely not, we can't close that area to economic activity. We rely on that, you're not having it. So all of these things need to be considered, and that's what systematic conservation planning allows. The last, I suppose, insight into the technicalities of systematic conservation planning is this. In BioProtect, we're developing a multi-scale systematic conservation planning approach. What multi-scale means is that what happens in Tralee Bay needs to affect what happens in Ireland, which needs to affect what happens in all of Europe, which needs to affect what happens in all of the world. Right? You can't simply have a top-down approach where, for example, imagine if the EU came in and said, right, close that area. How unpopular would that be? But it's equally unpopular if Ireland says, yeah, we're closing Tralee Bay to all economic activity. It can't happen. Top-down approaches are just too blunt and completely insensitive to local constraints and opportunities. The converse is true as well. Everyone can't go off and separately plan their own area, completely blind and ignoring what everyone else is doing. I gave an example at coffee there. Imagine you're given the choice between, right, we have to make a very difficult choice here. It's dolphins or sea lamprey. What are we going to protect? Have people seen sea lamprey, what they look like? Jawless fish with, no, the lamprey are going to lose every time, right? And if everyone separately plans their local area, in isolation to everyone else, what will happen ultimately is Ireland and Europe will not designate anywhere for sea lamprey. Every time there's the choice of dolphins versus sea lamprey lose. So that can't happen either. There has to be a multi-scale approach where everything and everybody is aware of everything else that's happening. And if that sounds complicated, it is, but we've developed a tool which is very, very makes the entire process transparent, easy, and also invites stakeholders to the process as opposed to only scientists. So it's the BioProtect Marine Planner and Engage platform. I won't talk too much about it because I have my colleagues, Pablo and Melis here, and at the lunch break, we're going to have a table outside, strategically placed close to the coffee. If you want to come along and see the platform, I'd invite you to come have a chat. But in short, what it does is we have an iPad, we bring it to stakeholder sessions. Every stakeholder or group of stakeholders can open an iPad, can open their phone, can open a laptop and start to contribute their data, right? Those data could be information that they have on habitats. So it could be reefs, it could be burrowing anemones, whatever it is. They contribute information about the uses that they have for the marine environment. So we have here finfish aquaculture. And all of this information feeds into a database along with all the information that we already have. And a facilitator, a workshop facilitator is running this on the back end, right? So you can see that systematic conservation planning grid that I spoke to you about, right? And you can see all of the features that are required. This is just an example, kelp forest. You can start to set your targets. Do we want to protect 30% locally, 50% locally, whatever it is? We can start to see what the interactions between ecosystem components and human activities are. I think you spoke to this a moment ago about the cumulative impacts. So you can see here, this region in the south of high cumulative impact, that's associated with demersal trawling, which obviously the seabed contacting fishing, very destructive, high impact activities. And then most importantly, that it helps to identify these areas that could be conserved, should be conserved, and would have minimal disruption, minimal socio and economic disruption, or however you measure the cost. So I think that this is a platform that really facilitates the types of interactions that have to happen in stakeholder engagement, both vertical, which is communication, say from a policymaker to the public saying, what we need to achieve, this is the information that we're using to make these decisions, as well as the horizontal interaction, which is that critical co-design and collaborative approach to establishing these MPAs. So I think I've gone a little bit over time, apologies on that. But please do, if you're interested, get in touch. That's my email address there. And as I said, we'll be next to the coffee. Come and have a look at the platform and we'll talk you through it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Oisín, and we'll be able to interact with that software over the next couple of days as well, which is super. So now, last but not least, I'd like to welcome Bob Rumes from the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences. Bob's going to talk to us about supporting MPA managers and coastal communities through the MPA Solutions Hub. So you're very welcome. Let's just press that arrow there.
All right, thank you, Eve, and thank you, Oisín, for setting me up. We have quite a few things in common. So I'll skip this one. This was developed as part of the Blue for All project. It's a 4-year project. We're in our last 6 months, so we can start presenting you with some of our outcomes. And I should tell you, this is a process born out of frustration with paper parks. If you look at the map above, you can see where light goes on, light goes off, nice, where MPAs have been designated across Europe. And you think, wow, that's amazing. We're doing well. We're happy. But lots of people are not happy. Lots of coastal communities are not even aware that the MPAs are there. And a lot of these MPAs, they're not actually being managed. They've just been designated. And we felt, as Oisín highlighted, that this is part because of this faulty way that sometimes MPAs are being designated. So there's a top-down push to start designating specific areas. So this 30 by 30 is actually driven by policy. But when you talk to people in the area, you see that the MPAs there, they don't really believe that they function. They don't meet their expectations, and often they don't end up meeting the conservation goals. So as part of our project, we looked around Europe, identified a number of MPAs that could serve as information sites, where we really started seeing what is working and what is not. For example, the lighting. And then we identified, as George already highlighted, those things that need to be addressed. We looked for the tools that function best, and we started applying them in our living labs. As also George said, I'm sorry, George, slight bit repetition is the key to memorization, so that's not too bad. We worked with both small coastal MPAs, like the small protection areas in Belgium, to actually massive basin covering networks of MPAs, such as the Baltic Sea MPA network, or the plans for the Irish MPA network expansion, in addition to those living labs with our information sites. So when we talk to MPA managers, we look for what are the main areas for improvement, and it's quite disconcerting when you see that they actually involved stakeholders in about 1/3 of the like only about 30% of MPAs involved fishermen when they were designating their MPAs. So if you're not talking to one of your major users, you will not get them to approve your MPA, or they will not cooperate with you. Most of them take into account the ecological features, but less than half were thinking about what happens when climate change scenarios and even less took into account the cultural heritage in these areas. So it's really important that you as an ecologist go beyond your comfort zone. We needed them to look at governance tools. And one way to do this is by taking account of ecosystem services. Few were mapping ecosystem services. Even fewer, like 15%, were actually trying to quantify ecosystem services. And then looking at how ecosystem services would change when you do a different management scenario was rarely even done. And then the crux of the matter, most MPAs do not have a financial strategy. They get a grant from the government and they need to survive on this grant, but they are faced with being asked to do more and more and more. So when we ask them, what do you want? What would you like at the end of the project? They say, well, we would like a way to get proportionate means to the task. We want a long-term perspective and we want coordinated governance. We've been talking about governance. When I first heard that Irish MPAs were managed by the Department of Public Housing, I was a little bit surprised. But then I realized, well, actually our Belgian MPAs are managed under the Public Health Department as part of the management of infectious diseases. So there is sometimes this lack of, okay, where should MPAs be placed? Get a coordinated governance. And I know that people are working on this, but the MPA managers are still dealing with having to report both to fisheries, to environment, and to other sectors. You talked about lots of data. There is lots of data, but when the MPA managers themselves need to use it to run their scenarios, they often don't have the access. So they need a way to get public data and easy to use, adaptable, user-friendly tools. Quick assessment of the governance. We ran an analysis in 8 EU member states on how the different MPA types were managed in their countries and to see how this affected the conservation outcomes. So it turns out that there was often quite unclear legislation, which resulted in MPAs not really engaging in enforcement because they were not even clear about the legal basis they could have for taking actions. Governance was fragmented, and operational management plans are still lacking in many of those MPAs. And then finally, I will repeat it a few times, but if you have limited and unstable funding, you cannot develop a long-term strategy. So where does co-creation come in? It's really like focusing on this alignment between the ecological goals, the local realities, and how to get the stakeholder buy-in. In our project, we established stakeholder engagement groups, which included the MPA managers. However, in many areas, there are no MPA managers. It's just a government department and people are not managing a single MPA, but they're often managing all the MPAs for a wide area. But in addition to the MPA managers, when available, we involved the local communities, the fishermen, authorities, policymakers, and scientists and experts. The goal was for improving acceptance, getting more realistic measures that are taken, and getting this long-term compliance. I think you said it in a different way, but MPAs are more effective when stakeholders are really partners and not just being consulted at some point. But it's a process that takes a lot of effort. You need to be started early, continuously, communicate frequently, and build trust. Without trust, it will not function. It's best if you can use existing structures such as MSP structures or local planning, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. Now I will go to the tools part. When we talk tools, people need a tool that is functioning and helping them in their daily need. So it's a concrete need that needs to be addressed. If you develop something, you have to have clear practical guidance. It's best if it comes through peer channels, because if you get something recommended by a friend or a colleague, you will be more likely to take it up. And if it aligns with the framework in which they're working, it also helps. Many projects, we've seen many presentations today about EU projects, and we ran an assessment of those 200 plus tools that were developed by EU projects. Only about 10% were still functional, because you get a 4-year funding, you maintain it for 2-3 years, and then it stops. And then a lot of that money is not used in the most efficient way then. So building long-term support for tools is actually also one of our goals. To do that, we developed the MPA Solutions Hub. It's an online platform where targeted at MPA managers primarily, but also at local communities, where you can find not just ecological tools, but also social tools, financial and governance tools. All of these tools come with step-by-step guidance and testimonials. People can compare different tools when they select it. And if you develop a new tool, and I will be talking to the people of BioProtect, you can upload them to the platform. In addition, some of you may have known R, where you can go on Stack Overflow. We're developing something similar. We have the MPA community network where people can get peer-to-peer support. We are launching it in September 2026. And you may say, Bob, that's quite late in your project. And that is true. The problem is you only get one chance to launch this thing. If people come and visit and it's not ready, they are not going to come back. So we're now populating the tool database. We are making sure the functionality is up to scratch, which is why it's only in September. Just a small preview. You can either use a generic search to search for a tool, or you can browse through the entire catalog. Once you identify tools, you can explore the tool details. For example, the MPA Finance Planner. It gives you information on the general aspects of the tool, which languages are available, who developed it, where it was used. A little testimonial, taking the different steps, why the tool was used, what the outcomes were. And then it will take you to a repository where you can find the data files associated with this tool. But it doesn't end with Blue for All. As part of the Forest project, we are continuing to expand and adapt these tools to make them suitable for the Atlantic and Arctic regions. And we're also improving languages. We don't have Gaelic yet. So if anyone is volunteering, we will hear from you. Also, what we will do is facilitate access to relevant data sources and allow for custom scenario testing. So if you have a specific MPA and you want to improve certain matters, such as, for example, stakeholder engagement, or you want to improve a certain ecosystem component, then we will allow you to do this testing as part of the platform. Okay, thank you very much.